This week, if you're like me and a little bit emotionally and physically exhausted from the New Year's and the holidays and all the kind of going out, you are in luck because I have a film that is on Netflix now for you. Again, Netflix released all of these awards contenders very briefly in theaters at the end of last year, and most of them, if not all of them, are now available in the comfort of your own home if you have Netflix. And so this week I have The Two Popes, and strangely, or not strangely, The Two Popes was actually one of my favorite films of last year, or at least I thought it was one of the most interesting watches of last year. It's a very actor movie, and it stars Jonathan Pryce as Pope Francis and Anthony Hopkins as Pope Benedict. And I've said this many times before in my reviews. I come from a Jewish background, so I don't know anything about the Catholic Church aside from what you hear in the news, which is not the most positive most of the time. But I also don't know about the inner workings of kind of how the Pope selection works. But I do know, and I do remember living through the living Pope deciding to retire essentially and step down. And it doesn't ever happen. Apparently it's only happened once or twice before. But my understanding of it was always like the Pope has to die for the next Pope to take the throne. See, this will show you how limited my knowledge of the Catholic Church is. Again, having lived through this, it was very eye-opening to see this kind of take on it. I thought it was really interesting. I've spoken out sometimes against very actor performance piece things, but when the actors are Jonathan Pryce and Anthony Hopkins, they are amazing, and they were so good in these roles. It was very hard to fault them for it. I thought it was really interesting coming at this from a perspective of knowing absolutely nothing about the inner workings. I'd be super interested to see if you did grow up in the Catholic Church and it was important to you, and I'd love to see people's reactions to that, because I think it'll resonate in a different way than it resonated for me in terms of an outsider looking in and being fascinated by cardinals electing a new pope and just the kind of weird democracy and politics of it. And maybe because it is happening at such a high level that nobody outside of ranking members of the Catholic Church understand, that it'll be interesting to you too. But either way, it's interesting. It's told in flashbacks, or it's told in multiple spans of their lives. It mostly focuses on Pope Francis, so Jonathan Pryce's character. And I also have to say, shout out to the man who plays the young version of him, Juan Mignone. I hope I'm not saying that wrong. He plays young Pope Francis, and he carries a lot of this movie and just does an excellent job. I'm not familiar or super familiar with his work, but I thought he did an amazing job in this. I will say this is a subtitle film for a lot of it, and there are a lot of kind of fun jokes around Latin and also Spanish. But so be prepared that you will have to read some in order to enjoy this film. I would not have expected a film to make me feel kind of sympathy and empathy for Pope Benedict, and not that Pope Benedict was necessarily a bad guy, but again, citing that whole Jewish thing and his background, you could see why I wouldn't necessarily have been the biggest fan of his election as Pope. But making me feel for that character as well, and his kind of decision to step down. And again, this is a fictionalization, so who knows if that was actually his decision, but it paints him in a probably more positive and sympathetic light than one would expect, which is not a bad thing in this case. It's not. It certainly doesn't let him off the hook. But this is less about the plot, because you know how it ends, right? One pope steps down, and it's more about the relationships and the politics between the two of them, and the overall politics of the Catholic Church. So I highly recommend checking it out. I think it's worth it. You don't have to leave your own home. It's it's there for you to muse on as you maybe make your resolutions for the new year and all that sort of jazz. So I'm going to give it 4.2 out of 5.